This is Cold Start.
And today, the topic of discussion is going to be the fabulous thing of aerodynamics in motorsports.
One of the first things I learned in how to drive a race car was the fact that you need a certain amount of grip from your tire to attack a corner, right? As you're coming into a braking zone and you're going to make a turn, you need to be thoughtful about how much total grip the tire has, right? I think you know this better than I as an instructor in this space, but the triangle we picture of the straight line acceleration, the braking, and the turning a tire can do, and there's a maximum of 100% that any tire can do of those three things combined. So what is it that we can do to actually exceed 100% of the tire's capability in terms of the grip that it provides?
Right, and I think that this is an interesting topic just because we both have very different ways that we've engaged with motorsports, where you, in your beginning of getting into racing, you dealt with single-seaters and things that had downforce, had aero, had wings, right? And things that are pushing the car into the ground a lot more, where my humble beginnings was in GT cars, saloon cars, tin tops, right? Whatever you want to call them. And those, for the most part, don't really have that much aero, or they're not as aero sensitive, or you don't have to pay attention to driving the car into the downforce. And that's a weird thing to say. And like you were alluding to with the demonstration of the tire's capability, there's mechanical grip that the car is able to provide, just the tire, the suspension to grip the pavement. But then there's also aero grip and how that also plays a part. And it's an interesting thing in motorsports. It's kind of divided between those categories of GT cars versus formula cars. And when we talk about open wheel and formula cars, aero is a lot more prevalent, and both of those things require very different driving styles as well.
One of those things I didn't realize early on is there are wings on production cars, sports cars. You know, these cars that we use that we call track cars that we bring to drive out, they'll generally have a big spoiler on the back, or a lot of times people tack one on because they think it's going to add some kind of downforce, and more often than not, it's more cosmetic than anything. But there is this sense that somehow this device on at least nominally the back of your car sticking up will give you some grip in the back, some downforce. I think from that concept, and it's such a minimal amount that you actually get on a street car, but as that applies to race cars at higher speed with different types of engineering, with different shapes on the cars, those wings, those little flicks and things that are done to disrupt the air and increase the grip, the downforce, actually do start to have a meaningful effect.
Well, I mean, a car in its neutral state, whenever it's going through air, a car naturally creates lift. And that means as you go faster, the car is wanting to take off, right? As it moves through the air, it's actually reducing the amount of weight that's being pushing on those tires into the ground. And so any sort of addition of downforce or aero, when we talk about aerodynamics, how something is designed to move through the air, they want it to actually push the car back to the pavement because we want to be touching the ground. And as much as we can continue to push and actually make our cars heavier as they go faster, they grip more, which is a weird thing to think about. And this is why, you know, supercar manufacturers put wings on their very fancy sports cars, is they actually want it to weigh more and have more grip and go through corners faster. And so there is this benefit of aerodynamics in terms of a car's performance, its handling capability. We understand this concept when we think about Formula One and those cars' unbelievable cornering capabilities is because of these aerodynamics pushing the car to the pavement, having it stuck. Now, the big question, the conversation I want to bring up is aerodynamics in general gone too far? Is it continuing to produce a good product in terms of motorsport on television, of continuing to pursue this continued development of aero, more efficient wings, more downforce? Is that good? Because we're seeing it in Formula One. We're even seeing it in NASCAR. They've talked a lot about downforce on the new Cup cars. And I would argue too much aero on a car ruins the product. It ruins the racing. It gets away from, in my mind, what motorsports should stand for.
I think there's a few ways to look at this. And so if we step back a little to recognize, cars are an engineered product. From the very first vehicles that we created, right, people got together and they had to understand the principles of physics and combustion and friction and traction and moving through the air in a way that never had been really contemplated before. So early on with the design of cars, they were for the first time tackling these issues that had never come up when they were riding horseback through the countryside or whatever it was. So early on, the sense that these cars could be made faster through further engineering made total sense. That's how we created this product in the first place. And it was through experimentation and maybe looking elsewhere in the development of related technologies that this idea of changing the amount of grip or downforce or ability of the car came from through these external devices being added to the car. The evolution of this was when we started seeing raised wings put on race cars, low ground effect skirts and diffusers and areas on the car that were built to help stick the cars to the ground. This kind of culminated in a terrible example in a way. The aerodynamics being used in race cars had been around for 20 or 30 years by the time the end of the 90s came around. In 1999, at the 24 Hour of Le Mans, there was a very famous incident where the Mercedes CLR race car, which had a big wing on the back to be clear, literally flipped over during the race, like driving down this main straight. To your point earlier, these cars create lift, and there was enough movement of the air underneath the front of this car that it overcame the weight and the downforce of the car, literally to flip it over in the air. It looked like it was flying through the air off of the racetrack into the trees. It was a horrible thing to see. Kind of spectacular, really, if you go back and you look at the footage of it, but recognizing this effect of lift and drag that gets created on a car is something that we have to manage really carefully. And it can be used for great effect in this way, adding the amount of speed or increasing the amount of speed a car can take into a braking area or a turn or through the turn, cars being able to stick to the ground when they otherwise would not. In this particular case in 1999, this was a car that created so much lift from the speed, the velocity that it had of the air coming under the front of the car that actually lifted the front of the car and the entire vehicle off the ground flying through the air. So it's obviously a very powerful effect that we have, the air flowing over or under the car while it's driving. It's a matter of how to channel or harness that to be used for good. And I think to come back around to your point, how do we use that for good in a way that increases the competitiveness of racing, increases the amount that we rely on driver capability in executing passes and driving down the racetrack and being quick about it? And then how do we use these technological improvements to aid the driver so that they can do even more than they're able to do potentially on their own without interfering with the dynamics of what it means to have a race car, to drive a race car?
Yeah, I think aero in general is another one of those topics that's become over-engineered throughout time. Like we talked about the golden era of cars and how modern street cars have become, in a sense, over-engineered. And they've missed the point of what a car is supposed to be about, the analog experience, the driver's experience. And I think there's a similar sort of mindset or shift that's been happening in motorsports as well, because obviously there was a golden era of racing when competition was very close, tight-knit battles, and there was this continued development of the aero like you're talking about through the years, being more efficient with how we move the air around the cars, sticking them to the pavement, getting faster and faster lap times. And I think that there's a strong argument that we've gone too far with this aero development. So I think that there's different categories to this, right? There's the difference of open wheel cars, formula cars, as well as GT race cars, and then even track day cars, right? There's different categories amongst all of those things. I think starting off first, we'll start with the formula cars because I think that's where it's most prevalent. And also kind of spinning off of our last episode of doing our recap of Formula One and some of those regulation changes going into 2026, we did talk a little bit about how the aero package, the downforce of the front, rear wing, and even the underbelly, so the flat bottom or the tunnels underneath the vehicle, the diffuser, is going to change into the next season for Formula One. Now, the biggest thing that Formula One is doing in those regulation changes is reducing downforce. I think that they're also recognizing that this continued pursuit of the complexity of the aero pieces on the formula cars to get the most efficient method of moving the air around the car, the most amount of downforce with the least amount of drag, has kind of created a problem in terms of the competitiveness and the wheel-to-wheel action in their product, in their sport. And there's this term that we should talk about, which is dirty air. Now, the more efficient that you can move one car through the air, creating downforce with the least amount of drag, it creates a lot of turbulent air behind the vehicle, what we coin a term as dirty air. So that front-running car will get clean, smooth air passing up and over it, and it's going to be the most efficient. It's going to work really well. But on the tail end of it, just like a plane flying through the sky, it's going to create a wake of this turbulent air that then the next car is going to go through. Now, that turbulent air is not going to move as efficiently over the body of the second car, which means it's not going to have the amount of downforce as it would if it was going through clean air. Now, this is why formula cars cannot follow really close to one another when they're racing competitively, because the trailing cars that aren't in the lead, and this car could be 4 seconds behind the lead car, and it's still noticing the effects of dirty air to where it's not being able to go through the corners as quickly as the car in front. And also, this is why Formula One created the DRS system to allow more competitiveness. Now, this dirty air concept, it's not just specific to Formula One. There's other racing series that are having to re-engineer their cars because of this concept, that they've gone too far with aerodynamics and now are having to kind of unwind, if you will, to be like, okay, dirty air is a problem. We're not producing good product. How can we work through these things? Formula One actually making a good step in their next direction.
It can be kind of hard to get your head around the dynamics of all this stuff. So if you imagine the air is a liquid and it's not entirely visible to you like if there was a body of water with a boat going through it, but effectively that's the same effect. Like if you put your hand out the window when you're in a car, you feel a lot of resistance. You're effectively blocking the air from passing where your hand is. And you feel that resistance in the effect of the wind going around your fingers and around your base of your hand and your wrist, because it's working around your hand and it's creating this force of resistance. So the wings, the splitters, the dive planes, all of these aerodynamic devices that could put on a car interrupt the flow of air and are trying to channel it in a specific way. Most of the time, that's to increase the grip on the tire, which is to say, push down on the tire, push the tire down into the racetrack to increase the amount of grip that we have, to increase the speed of quartering, and to increase the stability of the car at very high speed. The problem is, to your point, what happens when cars are really near each other and the car in front disrupts the air behind it, right? It disrupts the airflow that's going to now come over the trailing car. And if that trailing car is relying on downforce for grip so that they can be stable in a straight line or stable into a turn at high speed, they're going to have a bad time of it. They're going through that turbulent air, not unlike if you're a boat following another boat closely, there's that wake, the waves that come off of the back of the boat that's in the lead that makes it really choppy and difficult. That liquid medium of the water, much like the air, is disrupted for quite a bit of distance beyond that lead boat. And that's the effect that we're seeing with cars following each other, these formula cars with a lot of aerodynamics, where the dirty air is disrupting the flow of air over the second or third or following cars behind that leader. And it can lead to some unpredictable effects, which make things like following closely at very high speed sort of tricky. It makes it very difficult for overtakes to occur at all if you're the trailing vehicle because of the fact that you just don't have the amount of downforce and grip that that lead vehicle has. This has led to the introduction of things like the drag reduction system. So we had to create devices to reduce temporarily the amount of drag created by downforce as a result of having all these cars out there with high downforce racing close to each other. And the dynamics for it have mean compromise in the ways drivers can go about being competitive on the racetrack, trying to make close passes, trying to make tight maneuvers in areas where they might lose their grip suddenly and the cars break away. I guess another difference between the Formula car and the GT car in this way is that the center of mass is more centralized in the car versus being biased front or back. So what happens is when the car does lose grip, it's very sudden, and that breakaway is something that's hard to recover from versus in a GT car, that feeling of the front starting to get away, the rear starting to get away can be managed by the driver because it's just happening a lot more slowly in time, and the breakaway is a lot more gradual than what you see in a formula car losing aero grip.
Yeah. And moving from that, I think this is my hot take on the topic, which is if you want to have a competitive motorsport, a competitive race, wheel-to-wheel racing that's exciting on television, you need to simplify the aero. I think aerodynamics, complex aero, ruins the product. And that's the thing, is that aerodynamics, it is a cool thing, right? It makes cars go faster. I'm not against that. Big wings, in some situations, look really cool. Aerodynamics on cars look awesome. But that's more for like a time attack style event where you're trying to get the most out of the vehicle, just making it do one lap really, really fast. Whereas in racing, in contrast, the point of racing, the point of wheel-to-wheel racing is competition. It is wheel-to-wheel, side-by-side racing on track. And I think that there's kind of this mentality that's gotten a little out of hand in regards to formula cars of like, we need to make them faster. We need to make them more efficient. We need to utilize technology more and do all of these crazy things. And the focus is on the engineering development, which doesn't necessarily translate to road cars anymore. I mean, the technology that they're developing on Formula One cars for the aerodynamics, is that really being translated to how your Toyota Camry cuts through the air on the street? Probably not, right? They're just doing it for the sake of doing it. And Formula One's always been seen as this thing of like cutting edge and pushing the boundaries. But if there's this big focus on pushing the boundaries from an engineering perspective, I think they've lost that sense of what it takes to actually make a good product for racing on the track. And I think that this is a kind of a different discussion of like the mentality of Formula One with the engineering side of stuff and making these cars so sophisticated that the racing on track is actually not from driver to driver. It's car to car. And we hear a lot about this in Formula One of saying, oh, well, you're just in a fast car this season, or you have the better team that's figured out the engineering side of the vehicle, that's why you can perform so well. And I would argue that aerodynamics is a huge piece of this that kind of takes out the driver from the experience being behind the wheel. Where if we look at cars that don't have a lot of aero or simplistic aero, they move around a lot more. They're more dynamic. They slide. And that means that you behind the wheel have to have the ability to be able to manage and control the car. Where something with a lot of aero, it's just stuck to the ground. You just have to have the ability to do the right thing at the right time and have the proper timing to just push the vehicle, but not a lot of skill to have the car control. Like you're talking about with a car with very sophisticated aero, it's either gripped up or it's not. Right? There's not a lot of skill set of managing that perfect little breakaway point. And I feel like I'm getting very philosophical about essentially like why GT racing is so much fun, or like saloon car racing is so much fun, is because those cars are dynamic. We think about back in like the 90s and early 2000s of NASCAR racing, those things moved around. Those cars sucked at driving. There wasn't a lot of focus for the engineering development, aero sophistication of an early 2000s Cup car. But that made for really exciting racing, wheel-to-wheel racing. And not to mention, this is my biggest argument, something that has sophisticated aero, you can't touch one another, because if you barely touch each other and you break one of the 15 million dive planes that's on the side of the vehicle, now all of a sudden the whole aero balance of the car is off and you're no longer competitive. Where if you have a simplistic aero or robust aero, you can bang doors and the car can still perform it and it can still go on. And so I think that there needs to be this kind of shift happening in motorsports where we don't need the fastest lap times anymore. We want something exciting. And I think that this method or this shift has been happening in car culture in general of like everyone being like, let's turn it back to analog. Like we don't need the fanciest, craziest stuff or the biggest technology or the best engineering. Just go back to that core root of what made motorsports so fun, which I think back in the day was just simplistic formulas.
I think it's about a balance, right? Aerodynamics itself is a balance. Heck, racing and anything competitive is a balance. We're out there trying to achieve something together in a way where we're trying to be closely matched so it's fair, but ultimately we're trying to outperform one another. And I think what happens here is that the fact is aerodynamics exists in all cars. It's just a matter of how much that's being harnessed or used by the drivers actively as part of what they're doing to race. So if we look at NASCAR, maybe not just today, but prior generations of cars, they'd be racing at very high speed in very close proximity to one another, to the effect that there would be this side draft, right? This effect of the wind passing over cars as they're higher or lower than each other on the track. In an oval being close to each other, there's the effect of the wind blowing over one car onto the other that does have a meaningful effect on those. So it's not as if taking the wings and diffusers off of a car is going to eradicate aerodynamics from being a factor in the first place, right? If we go back to cars that were lifting off the ground and flying away, we said, but we really want to see those cars drive that fast. So maybe there's a way to overcome that effect of physics of the aero getting under the car to push it down. And I think it gave us an increase in speeds we were seeing, right, especially through cornering, could not have been previously achieved without those aerodynamic devices, right? The amount of wing or splitter or diffuser on the car does affect the amount of drag or negative lift that we put into place, right, to create that downforce. And that itself is a trade-off because too much downforce slows a car in a straightaway, right? It actually creates drag on the car so that it affects its upper bound top speed that could be achieved. And I think the driver of a car with aero on it knows this fact, knows the fact that the other cars being in close proximity to them can disrupt the air around them. And that's sort of a new dynamic and skill that they need to develop in being competitive with one another out on the racetrack. Where can you push? Where can you take the risk of going a little bit into that dirty air? I think it's a lot like a late braking situation. How far into that turn can you brake and still get the car to turn in time so that you could make your corner? Some of that is aerodynamics, but some of that's braking performance, tire performance, driver skill, and courage, balls that it takes to make that late braking maneuver so that you think you can overcome the amount of grip that is necessary to make the corner and get in front of the other driver. So I think aero has a place, and it's helped us to achieve in some ways what's a better product of higher top speeds, increased stability of cars at high speed, right? These cars get kind of twitchy, and there's a point where the downforce, the drag that we're creating, actually helps to make a more stable platform onto the car, to which point it allows for better high-speed racing and that those cars can go that fast and be stable, but it does definitely create that effect, that other side of this equation, right, which is the dirty air makes it hard to be predictable close to another car that's disrupting a lot of air in front of you. So I think it's really a back and forth thing. Downforce helps you with grip, but it also creates drag, which is a reduction of your speed over a straightaway, right? So it's how to balance those things. And I think part of the engineering that makes it interesting is to watch how do we find the balance at a specific circuit to achieve how much downforce we want to have versus how much drag we don't want to allow for a circuit that might have high speed and low speed sections combined. I think that's just a part of the engineering that makes for interesting setup of cars going into racing. But to step back from all of that, let's acknowledge the fact that it does allow for a new dimension of unpredictability to come into the handling of the race car and when we see multiple race cars driving next to each other at speed. It does add to this effect that we say overtaking is more difficult because of the dirty air, and we've come up with these contrivances like push to overtake or drag reduction to deal with that. And maybe I'm biased. I sort of started my racing career in open wheel Formula cars where I learned to use that downforce, that grip, the fact that you're so low to the surface of the racetrack that you're able to take advantage of the downforce, the air passing through underneath the car, what they call that Venturi effect that the diffusers create. And it also have been in a position where I've had to experience a sudden lack of downforce, driving in a straight line, and there's a bump on the racetrack. And for the speed that you're driving, you're actually using that ground effect on the car to the point where that little bump disrupts the stability of the platform of the car and makes it unpredictable, maybe induces a spin, which may or may not have occurred if you were driving in a car that wasn't relying on that downforce. So I guess I'm sort of talking about it from both sides. I can see the benefit of it. It's helped to create better racing, higher speed laps, right? Faster laps. But there is a new dynamic to manage, which does create some downsides in a close competitive racing kind of a setup.
See, and I think that's what's interesting is that because you're saying as aero developed, things got faster. But what we've seen in the last couple of decades is race cars getting slower.
That's true.
As they've continued to develop the aero, the cars that go to the 24 Hours of Le Mans, they're not hitting the top speeds at the end of the Mulsanne Straight as they were back in the 90s and the 2000s. Yes, the Mercedes took off. There were some other things that played into, because that car was very aero sensitive. And so they were trying to extract as much aero out of that car. And it was in a category where they were allowed a little bit more leniency, and they discovered, okay, yeah, we made this decision. The overhangs of the car were a little bit too much. It was a little bit too tilt sensitive in regards to its aero. So yes, cars were taking off. There was a couple that did that. There was also one that at Road Atlanta that took off as well. That was the GT1 Aero. And also those cars took off because they were in dirty air. They were behind someone. They didn't have as much pressure pushing down on the car because of the aero of the car in front of them. So it is this double-edged sword. 100% I agree with you. But even in NASCAR, they've developed more aero in these cup cars. I know no one wants to talk about NASCAR. It's boring, but it's even affecting what you would say is the simplistic form of racing. And NASCAR, we always talk about the speeds of those cars because they're just going in circles. So the exciting part of it is they're going over 200 miles an hour. Those cars don't go over 200 miles an hour anymore. No one's been paying attention, but now the cup cars are actually slower than they've ever been. The fastest that the cup cars ever were was back in the early 2000s or the 1990s when the aero was very simplistic. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that back then the racing was more dangerous. It really wasn't. And there's been a lot of development in regards to driver safety, car safety, track safety, all of these things. So, I mean, the whole argument that like aero is a safety feature of the vehicles to help maintain like that they touch the ground, I don't really see the argument. Also because I've also noticed that when NASCAR's done aero development, they've had a lot of cars start to take off more at the super speedways as soon as they get backwards because they had so much downforce when they were facing forwards. As soon as they get reversed around, they start taking off. We've even had in the last handful of years a lot of NASCARs go airborne because of these new things like the diffusers that they put on the rear and stuff like that. And they've actually had to continue to develop flaps.
The roof flaps, yeah.
Which now there's not even beyond the roof flaps and the hood flaps that were kind of been around for decades. There are now like A-pillar and C-pillar flaps because the cars were still having issues even being broadside that they were starting to pick up off the ground because now they're a lot more aero sensitive. And so I would say that like aero, we don't need complex aero for speed and for performance. And a car going through a corner faster than it could before because it has all of these new sophisticated aero, does that really produce better racing? I mean, I think that's kind of the argument is that, yes, it would create a better lap time, better time attack, more exciting of what is actually possible of what we can do with cars, but does that make better racing? And I think that's a very interesting topic of discussion. And even former IndyCar driver J.R. Hildebrand has been contemplating this whole concept of what is the actual product of racing that we want as enthusiasts and fans. And he's actually been working on this project. It's called the Blackbird 66. And it's this whole concept of taking what is the Formula Car formula and completely flipping it on its head of let's completely remove all wings, front and rear. Let's make a motor that can produce over 1,000 horsepower, put real big slicks on the rear of it, and then just have people jump behind the wheel and be like, all right, who can wrestle this beast the best? That's going to be the best driver. So I think that's more the argument on my end of like coming back to anti-downforce, anti-wings, is I want to see a racing series that puts the driver at the forefront of competition, that they're not hidden behind the engineering, the development of the car, the development of the aero. I want to see a battle of drivers and that skill set of how to manage and handle a car and not talk about aero efficiency and tire management and all that other stuff. Like, I just want to see people behind the wheel sliding cars around, fighting with it. You know, I want to see the drivers struggle. And I feel like Downforce hides a lot of that excitement and doesn't make a very interesting product on television because when a car is working really well and it's just gripped up on TV, you don't really see anything happening. But as soon as it starts to move around and slide and stuff like that, now you're understanding like the dynamic nature of the vehicle.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's definitely a trade-off here, right? I would say that each of these sort of forms of motorsport has its own formula, if you will, not just formula cars,
right,
but a way by which we evaluate performance. And to your point, you know, NASCAR and IndyCar do a lot of oval racing, and they measure, like if you look at the statistics during the race, what's going on, they measure the performance of cars in their speed, right? You'll see an average mile per hour or a mile per hour for a lap, and we see those stacked in a line, you know, sorting from the top speed going around that oval to the slowest speed, and that dictates who's in first place to who's in last place. If we look at the formula racing, we look at the style of racing where we do road courses, we have racers making left and right turns together. Those types of racing really generally look at lap times. They're not looking at a top speed. Like, I can't ever remember seeing a stacked list of the sorted performance of cars in Formula One by their top speed down the fastest part of the racetrack. So maybe it's a matter of, different strokes for different folks. What you're actually trying to achieve in a Formula car is a fast lap time so that you can be the fastest one to achieve the total duration and distance of this race. It's a 190-mile race. It's a 300-kilometer race, whatever it is. The first person to achieve that distance wins. And in NASCAR and in IndyCar, we're racing for a period of time and a nominal amount of laps, but we're looking at the speed in which those laps are achieved, not so much in how much time it took, but what was the maximum speed achieved for that lap. And so it's just a little different mindset. I think one might optimize for something differently than the other based on that sort of mindset. And I wonder how much that affects, J.R. Hildebrand coming up as a former IndyCar driver, having been measured to how many miles per hour to the thousandths of a mile per hour we're differentiating these cars' speeds versus lap times where, we differentiate at thousandths of a second. Similarly, in formula racing and time attacks styles of racing, the question is one more comparable to the other? Like, is the value of what's a fast lap at a racetrack in a kind of a car usefully different in formula car racing than it is in, let's say, NASCAR racing at ovals? I don't know. What do you think?
Well, I think this whole mindset of saying top speed or the fastest lap time, I think that's the same thing that in regards to manufacturers and producing new supercars nowadays, that they're so focused on the brochure numbers of 0 to 60, handling capability, top speed, where as enthusiasts, I think we're looking at modern day cars and just saying they're missing the mark. Yes, it can perform better. Yes, it can produce a faster 0 to 60, but it doesn't have the same feel that we want. And same thing with racing. I think that it's kind of pointless to continue to pursue after it needs to go this faster, which motorsports hasn't been that way. Things have been getting slower. F1 cars have been getting slower. NASCARs are getting slower. Indy cars have been getting slower. So everything's getting slower. So nothing's progressing down that path anyway, and they're going slower and doing it in a worse way. So at this point, let's not focus on the speed, but focus on the actual product of competition. Where IndyCar this past season, you had one driver run away with it because they focused on the hybrid system, which added a bunch of weight to the IndyCar. They weren't as agile. They weren't moving around as much. Not very good, exciting racing. Formula cars, they've been battling with dirty air for the last handful of decades, and so creating a simplistic formula of let's reduce those friction points. Let's not focus on making the fastest thing possible, but the best competition tool for drivers to showcase their talent. Because for me, it's a sport, right? And the drivers are the athletes, and I want to see the best athlete perform to a top level. I don't want to, maybe this is my opinion, I could care less about the engineers. I don't want to talk about Toto Wolff. I want to talk about his drivers.
Nobody wants to talk about Toto Wolff.
But you know what I'm saying? Because he's the one engineering the car, leading the engineer of the car, the technology. To be frank, that kind of bores me. I'm not a nerd in that aspect or an engineer that I want to know the complexity of the Venturi tunnels. I don't care. As a driver, yes, I'd be like, oh, this is so much cooler because I can go faster through the corner. But as a fan, as someone watching it on television, I don't think that there's an inherent value to that. And I think maybe that's the difference, is that aero cars that do produce a lot of aero, whether that's a radical formula car, an LMP3, whatever it is, they're really cool to drive. They're awesome to drive. Experiencing downforce, super rad, right? It's just mind-blowing of what cars can be capable of. But I think that that's not really the discussion here in regards to professional racing. I think
wheel-to-wheel racing.
Exactly. They need to be producing a car, whether it's IndyCar, NASCAR, or F1. I'm basically complaining to them that they need to be developing and producing a car that produces the best product and puts their drivers at the forefront of the competition. I think in recent years, for all three of those series, they've let the engineers kind of get away with it for too long, that there's been that emphasis on car development, car change, technology improvements, and not so much focus on the driver. Now the driver is just this small little tool that's just put the car on track and we'll do the rest of the calculations and changes from here in pit lane to maximize our race, where it's like, no, I want to watch a driver get behind the wheel and drive at 100% of their capability for the course of an hour and a half.
Yeah, there's always compromise to be involved here. And I think what we've recognized is that motorsports, as it's evolved, as it's matured as an undertaking, as a discipline, has also divided up in the fact that there are different types of motorsport and there are different techniques and approaches, but also different things that the fans get out of participating in or watching those motorsports. And I think if you look at the times when people tried to go across disciplines in these categories we've created for motorsports over time, we've had IROC as an example where we took some F1 drivers and put them in very not F1 type of running gear, and they didn't perform particularly well, right? The number of times you heard about Emerson Fittipaldi or Denny Hulme or Peter Revson, James Hunt in IROC was only kind of a spectacle because they were participating, but they didn't win the series. Conversely, I think if you took NASCAR drivers and, to your point, put them in a formula car, they'd be pretty at sea as well, unable to kind of figure it all out. So maybe it's back to this argument that there isn't one grand unifying identifiable thing about motorsports all up that's equivalent or can be compared, but rather we've created these multiple flavors whereby there are big cars that need to be brute force, manhandled through turns, sliding around on the pavement. They're slower overall, but they sound good and they're loud, and we see rubbing is racing, and there's a lot of contact and opportunity for unpredictability. Then you look at formula racing where we have these cars that are more precisely engineered, but they go faster. They can go faster into turns. They turn quicker lap times. The amount of science and engineering goes into them is leagues beyond what we've seen in NASCAR and stock car racing. But there is this limitation that exists where in the dirty air, it can be hard to predict what's going to happen next. But ultimately, isn't unpredictability why we watch motorsports? If we could predict who's going to win every race or what car was going to be the fastest or what the dynamics were going to be, what the weather was going to be, we wouldn't even need to watch. Like, we would just go run it on a sim and tell us who won afterwards.
But wasn't Formula One like that for many years?
It was. It's the truth.
And maybe that was a byproduct of the over-engineering of the engineering that went into those cars. It created the separation of the teams of the haves and the have-nots. And for a long time, it was always the joke of Formula One races, everything gets decided in turn one, and then you're watching an hour-long slot car race of them just, and nothing exciting is going on. And I think that was a big factor of the dirty air. They've done a great job, F1 has, of trying to change things. And in 2020 or around that time of when they made the big shift of the sizing of the cars and how the aero's produced, I think we got a better product. And I think them reducing the sophistication of the aero was a great decision. And then going into next year, they're continuing down that path. Hopefully their hybrid system doesn't ruin what they're working on with the aerodynamics. But I think that we're seeing kind of a backing off of the continuation of developing technology and racing, because this over-technological side of stuff we've seen is not necessarily the answer for car enthusiasts in manufacturing as well as the product of motorsport.
Yeah, we've seen the technological advances stall out because there's a point where cars were moving so quickly that humans couldn't manage them at that speed without very unpredictable results, right? Those cars taking off, flying in the air or crashing off or something like that. But I'll come back to this point, and even to early Formula One, there was a lack of reliability with some of those cars. They wouldn't all finish races because they were trying to do things, innovate engineering-wise, or they just didn't have the technology to repeatedly perform a process so that they could have a reliable car for every race. Isn't unpredictability what makes for good racing? I have to come back to that point, right? You watch NASCAR because, oh man, I don't know what's going to happen. These guys are going to smash into each other and somebody might come out ahead who we didn't expect. Similarly, we watch formula racing because we don't know who's going to win that race. We don't know what team is going to be victorious, although we have some idea maybe based on dominating technologies or teams or drivers in those sports. But I guess at the end of it, we all like to watch a race that's really close to the end and where the drivers are sort of battling it out all the way to the finish line, not somebody who blows doors at turn one and is in the lead for the whole race and it's not fun to watch. And I think that's less of an artifact of aero and downforce versus just the nature of how we've created these sports, their leagues, the teams, the money behind those teams, how we incentivize where development is done and how things are made to be better. So I think if we uncapped all the regulations, if we go back to like the old Can-Am and kart days where teams were basically left on their own devices to develop whatever they could, go as fast
Right.
as you could, be as grippy as you could be, use whatever mechanisms you could come up with. The same way through which you might call cheating innovation in racing. Teams have found creative ways to increase the speed of their car, to reduce the amount of time it takes for them to make a lap, or to increase the total maximum speed of those cars. So I think things that continue to do that are generally good for racing. But we have hit this inflection point many years ago where the speed of the cars no longer allowed humans to drive them in a way that they could actually be managed at that speed. So I think it was Downforce that allowed us to do this to the point where now we see cars going through turns at over 200 miles per hour. And there are passes that occur. They are dicey. They are tricky, but they do occur. We see cars passing each other into Eau Rouge and Rédillon at Spa, in a place where cars, it used to be held up as, can you be flat through Eau Rouge? Can you even drive the car and stick to the pavement at that speed?
Yeah, but now the cars have developed so much that now Eau Rouge is easy flat. So now you've created this corner that used to be this like gut-wrenching, separate the good drivers from the bad drivers to, yeah, it's easy, it's flat. And I think that's the excitement a lot of F1 fans have for this next-gen car, that it's going to be producing less downforce to where those corners, again, are now going to be, it's not perfectly flat. So who can manage it the best or just lift just only a smidge and can hold on to the car and make it through? And back to that argument about the unpredictability, yes, that's what creates good racing. What creates unpredictability in regards to a race, in my opinion, less downforce, right? The harder a car is to manage, to not slide it, to not lose the rear end on the exit, whatever it is, or managing it through a corner, which is less downforce, makes a car harder to manage through the corner, leads to more mistakes, leads to more changes. I think that's less downforce does create a little bit of a better product in that sense. So I think it's this interesting thing, because I think that, like, yes, downforce is cool, it's exciting, it's fun, but I think it's gone to the point that it's created a worse product in regards to motorsport.
I hear what you're saying. I'd say it doesn't create a worse product in regard to motorsport. I'd say it creates definitely a worse product in terms of close racing where contact is allowable, where we want to allow drivers' capability alone to differentiate one performance from another versus what the cars or the engineering or the team or the strategy was able to add to it. You know, at the end, I think there's different kinds of motorsport for different kinds of fans and drivers.
Yeah.
And ultimately, that will continue to be the case. I'm not sure I fall on the side of aerodynamics has made for worse racing, but I'll acknowledge readily that it's changed racing a lot. It's changed the way we spend budget on cars and how we manage them. And I think it's a challenge to Formula One and IndyCar and any of these series that runs on a car where aerodynamics is a big part of the performance. It's a challenge for those series to be able to figure out how to embrace some of the aspects of NASCAR, stock cars, Trans Am cars that aren't built around and relying heavily on the aerodynamics for their performance. How do we achieve both of those things? Is there a way?
Well, I would argue that I agree with you that there needs to be a separation of products, in the sense of, if you're not into aero, if you don't like the sophistication of the engineering, that you do have something that you can go and watch. I think that right now everything's tainted with aero. NASCARs are heavily reliant upon their aero. They run them so low because of the effects of the diffuser and everything like that. Any little thing that now goes wrong with a cup car ruins its aero balance, ruins the car. These cars run so low nowadays. If you blow a tire in a cup car, I am not kidding you. If you blow a tire in a cup car, it will sit on the ground and the cars are not able to make it back to the pits.
Right.
What I'm saying is all of these series have gone down. Aero is tainting every series of motorsports. GT4 racing, those cars have wings on the back of them. Then they have a front splitter. NASCAR, now they have diffusers. They're made out of carbon fiber. They actually do have pretty sophisticated aero, even though they don't have a massive wing on the back of it. I would say that the only form of motorsport currently that would go by those like old style rules, which is high horsepower, low downforce, car moves around a bunch, and you can bang fenders, is the V8 Supercar series in Australia. That is the most exciting of. The motor is kind of the centerpiece. It sounds incredible. This high-pitched, high-revving V8, the sequential transmission whine. They're so close in their racing style. The cars drift on exit. They're driving those things 10 tenths all the time, banging curbs. it's spectacular. And to me, I truly believe that's the last form of that kind of old style of motorsport. So I would agree with you that there should be this separation in product. And I would encourage and I would hope that someone comes out with a racing series that brings up those old mentalities. Even the Can-Am cars that you mentioned, high horsepower, low weight, no downforce. Those things are ungodly fast, and they don't have sophisticated aero on them. They were just shaped like a wedge. I mean, they kind of threw driver safety and everything out the window. I would love to see something like that again in the modern era with a little bit more emphasis on driver safety and the well-being of everyone involved. But something like J.R. Hildebrand of trying to come up with this series of, not replace Formula One, not replace IndyCar, but create another series that kind of has more of that old school mentality of just high horsepower, big tire, no aero, who can wrestle the beast the best. I think that's perfect. And I would love to see the demographics and the viewership going forward over the next 5 to 10 years if that series got produced of could they stand up to F1 and IndyCar? Would people actually gravitate towards that? Or am I just one person on a lone island just yelling, I hate downforce?
I might ask the same question just to be a little provocative about safety in race cars. You mentioned that. Was racing better when the race cars and the racing overall was less safe? That was a more unpredictable outcome when some person might die today when we're out there watching the race because those cars are so on the limit that it might just explode, or it might run into the wall and crash into flames, or we might see actual fatalities. And does that increase in this sort of gladiator style competition the benefit or the desire of people to lean in and watch this thing? I mean, maybe that's saying it a little too strongly, but there is a point where we all take our preferences away from what we watch and what we're engaged with. And maybe it's just a matter of there's this sort of more brute force, close contact, cars moving around type of racing that's just a sort of different set of principles or philosophy than cars that are made to go as fast as they can around a circuit, to use whatever mechanisms that they can deploy or innovate to do so, and also figuring out how to allow drivers next to one another to actually compete. I mean, that's really the key here. If this was just time attack, it would be a completely different form, and we wouldn't put it in the same category as wheel-to-wheel racing. So ultimately, I think that's the differential, but maybe we'll just have to agree to disagree. And maybe it's just different flavors of what we call exciting and what performance is, but we should continue to try to push the envelope. I think we want to see cars go faster. We want to see racing that's closer, more competitive races, closer outcomes, less predictability overall. And there's ways to do that don't necessarily jeopardize safety or throw away the baby with the bathwater. I think there's benefit to be had, and I don't think we need to get rid of all aero because you can't. Anything that's an object moving at speed through the air experiences the forces of physics and aerodynamics that prevent it from moving as smoothly and efficiently as it could as if it was in a vacuum. So we have to acknowledge that that's just one of the dynamics of cars moving over distance, but how much we harness that fact versus the power of the engine, the grip of the tires, the capability of a driver to actually wheel the car and depress the pedals the right amount at the right time, right? That's ultimately what this sport is about. So I think we want that all to continue, but it's how to find the right equation to balance those things to continue to make it more exciting and more fulfilling to watch and to participate in.
I can tell you for sure the answer for the future is not electric. If any of these series go full electric, they're completely losing me.
I'm gone already. Formula E, theoretically...
Who watches Formula E? Really, honestly. Anyone that's listening, have you ever... I've never watched a full race of Formula E. Have you?
I've tried. Why don't we make another episode all about our experiences trying to do what we can to see this new way of motorsports coming along and supporting it and then realizing it's not something that we can stand behind.
Are you going to tell me for the next episode you're going to force me to watch a Formula E race and give you my take?
No, I can't force
Sounds like
any
torture.
I wouldn't force any friend of mine to watch that. But there are things to be learned from it, and similarly here we're saying we developed a technology that's now gone too far. And
yes,
I
think that's a great example of you want to make racing into this kind of perfectly correct and safe activity. It's electricity. It's full EV racing, and I don't think any of us want that.
And then beyond that, it's the robots racing each other. And I can tell you, nobody's going to watch the robots race each other until they're crashing into each other at high speed and bursting into flames.
Well, now we're getting back to crashes.
Here we are.
Risk the robots.
It's amazing how everything comes back around, isn't it? It's the natural oscillation of the universe.
Human beings just want to watch carnage at the end of the day.
I guess that's what this is about. So we call it motorsports, but it's gladiators, it's the lions, it's whatever it is. At the end of it, we can't look away, and we're just all waiting for the next one to come along. So let's make that as productive and as good of an experience as possible, preferably not at the expense of dying humans along the way, but, people get their thrills in lots of different forms.
Yeah, I'm going to still stand on my soapbox of the best aero is no aero, but we'll see how that all plays out in the next handful of years.
We sure will. Awesome. Really fun conversation. Thanks, Sylas.
Thanks, Todd.
Thanks for listening to Cold Start.